Welcome to our first SASH session of 2024. Brief congratulations to all our new board members and returning. They've been hard at work on a number of fronts. Founded in 1993, SASH works to promote, facilitate, and disseminate research into the rich history and heritage of soccer in the United States. You can find this on the web at ussoccerhistory.org and on social media with our Facebook and Twitter accounts. If you'd like to join the society, it's a great value at $20 per year. Visit our website, and you can do it through the Join SASH tab. A really warm welcome from the society to Dr. Zach Bigalke for today's SASH session. I say doctor because Zach just defended his PhD dissertation. So congratulations to you from all your friends here in the society. Zach's dissertation is on multinationality and the World Cup, and it's been awarded to him by the Department of Kinesiology at Penn State University. Zach is the longtime secretary of our SASH executive committee. In addition to his work on the history of soccer, he covers a range of themes across sport. His most recent research rabbit hole, and lots of us go down similar rabbit holes, is on the influence of Japanese competitive eaters at the Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest. We know that Coney Island and Joey Chestnut and his competitors. So he will have his article published in the next issue of the Journal of Sport History on competitive eating. And there is no truth to the rumor that we will have a SASH hot dog eating contest to celebrate that article and to celebrate Zach's PhD dissertation being finished. But we're ever so proud of Zach, and it's a thrill to have him here to share some of his research with us today. So I'll turn it over to Zach.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the wonderful introduction. It is really great being here with all of you for a SASH First Friday session, and to be here actually talking about some of my research than just being the tech guy on the back end and monitoring the waiting room as the bouncer. So as Tom said, my dissertation research really looks at multinationality and the World Cup. And I want to take this time today to deconstruct the melting pot that is U.S. women's soccer, and to think about the broader participation of American-born women at the FIFA World Cup beyond those who suit up for the U.S. women's national team. So the photograph you see in front of you was taken of the Philippines national team, their starting 11 for a friendly right ahead of the 2023 World Cup. And I think that this picture really captures the extent to which American institutions have shaped the women's game at the international level around the globe. 9 of the 11 players you see here were born in the United States. Each of the 9 in this photo were among the 18 American-born women who were named to the Philippines World Cup roster that competed in Australia and New Zealand in 2023. Now, during my dissertation, I spent several months compiling a data set of biographical information on more than 10,000 men and women who competed at the World Cup. It was an endeavor, we'll say. But one thing that stood out is something you see scrolling on the screen here. A high number of American-born women who competed for another national team over the 32-year history so far of the Women's World Cup. Now, since China hosted the first officially sanctioned FIFA World Cup in 1991, 44 different women's national teams have qualified for at least one of the tournaments. And in those tournaments, a total of 2,419 women that were born in 64 different sovereign states suited up for one of those 44 national teams. Of that total, 217 women, more than 9% of the total pool who played in at least one World Cup, were born in the United States. To contextualize the significance of American women's participation at the World Cup, I compared the 7 women's national teams that have qualified for every tournament: Brazil, Germany, Japan, Nigeria, Norway, Sweden, and the United States. And as this chart shows, the 7 national teams each called on roughly the same number of players over those 9 tournaments, the bar you see in light blue here. When projected alongside the number of players born in that nation state who competed for any national team at the World Cup, the red bars you see on the chart, only one of those perennial qualifiers showed a wide discrepancy between the two figures. Now, breaking the numbers down, the U.S. women's national team named 108 American-born women to a World Cup roster between 1991 and 2023. 44 of those women appeared for the United States on at least 2 U.S. World Cup rosters, including 12 that played in 3 World Cups, 9 that competed in 4 World Cups, and 2 that were named to 5 World Cup rosters. With this group of experienced talent, the United States won 4 of those World Cups and reached the semifinals of every tournament except the most recent one in 2023. That, of course, leaves another 109 American-born women who competed at the FIFA World Cup but did not represent the United States in the tournament that we must still consider here. For one reason or another, those 109 women instead featured for one of 24 other national teams that qualified for a World Cup. Each of their decisions, we must keep in mind, was contingent on forces that are largely outside of the athlete's control. In my dissertation, I focused on 3 dynamics of what I call sporting citizenships of convenience. Over the rest of my talk today, I will show how these dynamics guide multinational athletes' choices as they decide which of their identities to privilege on the pitch. Further, I will illustrate how those dynamics shape each athlete's relationship to national identity once she decides which jersey to don. Because it organizes the World Cup as a competition between nations, FIFA and its member organizations depend on absolute adherence to unitary nationality as a fictive construct. Even after FIFA loosened its policies about nation swapping for young players in 2020, the underlying structure of international soccer continues to force these athletes to make instrumental decisions about their sporting identity. A woman born and raised in the United States who has multinational roots must choose whether to be American or to adopt another nationality in the eyes of FIFA. Unlike men in earlier generations who operated under looser eligibility policies, the Women's World Cup has always functioned under policies that enforced unitary sporting nationality. But those who choose a path that diverges away from the U.S. women's national team do not merely transform themselves into their adopted nationality. Generations of soccer fans in the United States, including all of you here with me today, are all too familiar with the ethnic connotations that have informed the development of the game in this country, as many American sports fans long saw soccer, and indeed many American sports fans still see soccer as the provenance of quote-unquote hyphenated Americans. In choosing to compete for a different flag than the Stars and Stripes, and by electing to sing a different anthem than the Star-Spangled Banner, these women transform themselves not into their adopted nationality, but into a new hybridized, hyphenated nationality. Each player who makes this choice publicly transforms her identity into that of an American Mexican, or an American Filipina, or an American Jamaican, and so on. Making the instrumental decision that allows one to compete at the World Cup thus exposes the liminality of an athlete's multinational identity through such a public decision. In this context, it is also critical to understand the decision each woman makes about which national team to compete for as a labor decision. In a sporting sense, what a multinational athlete does when she chooses one national team over another is objectifying a part of her identity in service to a collective project that goes beyond the pitch and serves as a site for national meaning. Sports fans often describe this phenomenon as a matter of the name on the front of the jersey meaning more than the name on the back of the jersey. The athlete thus becomes a cog in the machine that is the national team, an alienated laborer whose produce is not entirely her own and is divorced from the personal meanings she might ascribe to each performance. These are the dynamics that each of these 109 women navigated in order to compete on the biggest stage in the sport. Women who choose to compete for the US women's national team must also navigate some, if not all, of these dynamics, especially those few that can explicitly claim multinational roots. It is the interplay between their instrumental decisions, the alienation of their labor, and the public exposure of their liminality that shapes the experiences of women who choose to leave behind the land of their birth and play for another geopolitical space besides the United States. But that interplay between these three dynamics is dependent on a range of contingencies that shape what options are available to each multinational athlete as they decide which national team's colors to don. FIFA policy is but one barrier to entry that these players face. Each nation state has its own laws around naturalization and dual nationality that dictate whether athletes can privilege certain parts of their identities. Some national federations are more receptive to the idea of including players with diasporic roots on their national team than other federations might be. And even within a federation, a single coaching change or other shift in leadership can have dramatic impacts on the opportunities available to a multinational athlete. Each of these 109 American-born women thus took advantage of specific contingencies during their career to reach the pinnacle of soccer competition when the opportunity became available. For one example from my dissertation, new laws passed by the Mexican government in the mid-1990s suddenly made dual citizenship available to millions living in diaspora in the United States. Without this political shift in how the federal government defined Mexican nationality, the talent pipeline would have remained closed off to the national team. Given how national team coach Leonardo Cuellar leaned on an American-Mexican group of players to help Mexico qualify first for the 1999 World Cup, and then again in 2011 and 2015, women's soccer history would look quite different in Mexico without these legalistic contingencies falling into place for players who grew up as part of the Mexican diaspora in the United States. Two generations of American-Mexican stars, like California-born Elena Garcia Mendez, shown here at the 2011 World Cup, were the product of a conscious movement to recruit players from the diaspora and to begin their journey on the national team as early as possible. So contingent factors have led some national teams to historically rely on American talent to fill out their rosters more than others. Along with Mexico, Jamaica, and the Philippines, who we encountered at the beginning of this presentation, also depend heavily on a talent pool that was born and raised in the United States. On the other end of the spectrum, 11 national teams have called on only one US-born player throughout their team's history, including 4 who moved away from the United States as children and developed within the youth systems of the nations they represented, rather than American youth systems. Still, how each of the 109 American-born women decided to compete for another nation may differ from case to case, but what remains constant is the influence of the red, white, and blue throughout the tournament's history. In total, 23 different national teams called on at least one American-born player to fill out a World Cup roster, meaning that Americans have suited up for more than half of the 44 women's national teams that have qualified for at least one World Cup. And over time, the share of national teams with at least one US-born player at the World Cup has continued to climb. Because American-born women play such a prominent part throughout World Cup history beyond just the US women's national team, it raises three big questions. First, given the men's team has historically been an importer rather than an exporter of soccer stars, why do so many other nations turn to the United States for elite women's talent? Second, what factors lead certain nations to depend more heavily on the US talent pool to compete at the international level? And finally, where do we find these dynamics of liminality and alienation at play in these women's experiences? To answer the first question, we must look at the impact of Title IX on the growth of the women's game. Passed in 1972, this amendment to the 1964 Civil Rights Act fueled a revolution in women's sport. The logic behind Title IX is simple and is captured eloquently in its 37 words. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The amendment effectively forced any school receiving federal funding, from kindergarten through institutions of higher learning, to allocate equitable amounts of funding for men's and women's activities on campuses. While Title IX does not explicitly talk about sport, one of its most profound impacts was on sports participation for girls and young women. According to the National Federation of State High School Associations, only 700 girls participated in high school soccer in the year before Title IX's passage. By 1991, when FIFA first hosted an official World Cup for women, there were 121,000 girls participating in high school soccer. 20 years later, as Title IX approached its 40th anniversary, that number had more than tripled again, as more than 360,000 teenage girls played soccer for their high schools. While traditional soccer powers lagged behind in providing coaching, competition, and funding for girls and women's soccer, schools around the United States picked up the slack as part of their legal obligations to foster equitable environments for all students. That created a pool of talented soccer players that was deep enough to fill multiple international rosters. And since each nation can only field one team in the tournament, many of these women had to look elsewhere if they wished to play in a World Cup. That, in turn, leads me to answer the second big question about why some national teams seem to rely more heavily on American-born women. Across the globe, women's soccer has historically suffered from a lack of investment and a lack of support from FIFA and national federations. Many women saw little incentive to devote resources. Many nations saw little incentive to devote resources to building up the requisite infrastructure for their women's teams to become competitive. To fill that void, national team coaches turned to ready-made talent that developed under Title IX as part of national diasporas in the United States. These children and grandchildren of immigrants represented a chance for national teams to fast-track their development and become World Cup qualifiers without expending an outsized amount of their own funds on youth systems and training. Much as we hear about men's teams turning to their diasporas for an infusion of skilled players to their roster, think, for instance, about the Morocco team that advanced to the semifinals at the 2022 Men's World Cup. so too have women's teams embraced the boost that American-born players can offer to their squads. Many of these women played with and against other future World Cup talent, with California providing the largest share of participants on both the U.S. women's national team and other national teams. Title IX combined with an elite youth sports industry to afford those in certain geographic locations greater access to coaching and club competitions, and in turn, it resulted in increased opportunities for development. The New York, New Jersey area, also historically a hotbed for men's soccer development, also boasts a strong presence in both the US and foreign national teams, as you see here. As with the Mexico case I described a few minutes ago, though, teams are only able to turn toward these US diasporas when pathways to dual citizenship exist for athletes born in the United States. Similar pathways to dual citizenship exist for the children of Filipino and Jamaican immigrants in the United States, which helps explain the high number of American dual nationals on both teams' rosters at the 2023 World Cup. Haiti and Ireland have also turned to their diasporic connections in the United States to strengthen their teams, albeit to a lesser extent than Mexico, Jamaica, or the Philippines. On the other end of the spectrum, regular qualifiers like Nigeria, Japan, and Brazil have only recently turned to the US to bolster their ranks. Thailand, which could implement a similar recruitment program to the Philippines, thanks to similarly open dual citizenship laws, actually became less reliant on American-born talent between its first World Cup appearance in 2015 and its return 4 years later. Legal opportunities are thus necessary, but not sufficient in and of themselves to predict which teams will rely on these diasporas to reach the World Cup. So players from the United States need to be legally able to claim dual citizenship, but they also need one of their multinational identities to align with a national federation that is actively recruiting from its diasporas, or at least willing to entertain the notion. Not only is legal sanction required, but there must also be institutional buy-in from federation executives and national team coaches. So we know why this pool of talent exists and why some federations turn to that talent to strengthen their chances of reaching the World Cup. But how does the decision to adopt dual citizenship and play for another national team affect these women? To finish up my talk today in the last 10 minutes or so, I want to highlight how these players reveal traces of the three dynamics that make up these sporting citizenships of convenience. Through their public statements, we can learn a lot about these feelings. In my dissertation, I devoted a chapter to the American-born women who competed for Mexico across 3 World Cups. And while I will incorporate some of their statements, I also want to highlight how women who played for other national teams show how these dynamics transcend any single dual nationality. To begin with, the instrumentality of these women's decisions shines through in their comments in the press. Most of these women who doffed the red, white, and blue to don another nation's colors grew up of dreaming to play for the United States. While FIFA requires every multinational athlete to make a decision about which national team to play for, these women recognized that embracing the hyphenated part of their American identities was ultimately their only pathway to playing in a World Cup. Mika Hansen, who played for Denmark at the 1999 World Cup, was one of the earliest to acknowledge this reality. I always hoped to play for the US team, but I came to the realization I wasn't going to play for the US, she said in a June 1999 interview with Soccer America. Hansen, by this point, was 24 years old and playing for a semi-pro Danish club when she competed at the World Cup for Denmark. But even younger players come to similar realizations about their most realistic path to reaching the tournament. Linnea Quiñones was just 18 years old and fresh out of high school when Leonardo Cuellar named her to Mexico's roster for the 1999 World Cup. But she already felt that her chance to play for the United States had passed her by. Speaking to a reporter from the Chula Vista Star News ahead of the World Cup, Quiñones defended her decision by saying, "I just want to make it to the World Cup. That has always been my dream. I had dreamed about one day representing the United States, but I never got the chance." She started all 3 matches for Mexico, so she realized her dream of playing in the World Cup. But it came at an instrumental cost of sacrificing part of that earlier dream of doing it for the United States. For Mariela Giacome, who played for Ecuador at the 2015 World Cup, embracing her father's native identity served an even deeper instrumental purpose. 8 months before my father passed from cancer, he told me that he wanted me to play at the highest level I could, Giacome said in an interview with Goal Nation in June 2015. Now I have the opportunity to honor that dream, and I'm extremely grateful for that. The instrumental decision hovers over everyone who chooses to embrace their multinational identity to compete outside the borders of their birthplace. But different motivations inform that decision and shape the instrumentality guiding that decision. Even those with tenuous connections to multinationality willingly embrace non-American identities if it can help them reach the pinnacle of their sport. Kendall Michner, part of Mexico's 1999 World Cup roster, became a dual national not because of deep family roots, but because of the simple quirk that her paternal grandmother worked at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City when she gave birth to Michner's father. Because her father was born on Mexican soil, Michner was able to seek out dual citizenship under the new Mexican citizenship laws. I had aspirations of playing for the U.S. national team, Michner noted in an interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer prior to the 1999 World Cup. But I guess when you realize where you are with your game, I realized that wasn't within my reach. For some players more than others, then, we can explicitly interpret dual citizenship as merely a means to an end of reaching the World Cup itself. In all of these cases, though, athletes must also confront their liminal position as multinationals. Mimi Osei Aguiman, who grew up in Portland, Oregon, with a Ghanaian father and an American mother, articulated that liminal position in an interview with the Oregonian ahead of the 2003 World Cup. "I was born in America. I grew up in America. My father is from Ghana. I have dual citizenship, so it's like I'm from 2 different places." She went on to talk about how being the first foreign-born Ghanaian on Ghana's national team meant that I'm always under scrutiny from the media and from Ghana's fans. It hasn't been terrible, but we're from 2 different worlds. For many American Mexican women, their upbringing in borderland states heightens the liminality of their identity. Monica Gonzalez, for instance, spoke about how geopolitics, rather than migration, turned her into a dual national. "My grandfather was born in Mexico," Gonzalez told the Albuquerque Journal reporter Rick Wright in 2007. "The rest of my family has lived in Texas since Texas was Mexico." Gonzalez's statement reveals an inherent contradiction and liminality that shades all of those experiences for people living in borderlands. Some express their liminal status in ways that also illuminates the social alienation that helped drive their instrumental decision. Karen Bardsley, England's stalwart in goal across 3 World Cups between 2011 and 2019, was one player who did not dream about competing for the Stars and Stripes. "I've lived all my life in the US, but to be brutally honest, I don't really have any ties to the country apart from my mom and dad, Bardsley told the reporter from The Guardian a few months before making her first World Cup start with England. Most of the rest of my family live in the Stockport area, and I've always related more to that side of my background. While the instrumental decision might have ultimately been easier for Bardsley to make, it was shaped not only by the desire to alienate her labor to play at the top of her sport, but also to embrace a part of her identity that was alienated by the geographic reality of her upbringing. Like these other dynamics that shape sporting citizenships of convenience, alienation is multifaceted in how it appears among multinational athletes. As Bardsley highlights, that alienation can be baked into the formative experiences of an athlete. It can also manifest itself more clearly as forms of alienation tied to their visibility as avatars of the nation. That might manifest as public scrutiny, as it did for Osea Gimang when she spoke about the constant scrutiny she faced as a foreign-born member of Ghana's national team. Mexican international Susana Mora expressed a similar social alienation to the Los Angeles Times, saying that the people who didn't accept us right away were the Mexican people. They would always say, send them away, we don't want Americans. For others, it more clearly manifests as workplace alienation. While Mora differentiated between the Mexican public and the Mexican national team, her American-born teammate Monica Gerardo said in a separate LA Times interview that the Mexican-born players themselves were hesitant to accept us. They're not really Mexican because we're not born there, and that sort of thing. For some more than others, their alienation showed up as a diminished sense of belonging within their own team. For others, it might appear more as an inability to fully assimilate into the nations they represent on the pitch, or an unwillingness by that nation itself to fully accept these representatives as legitimate. By pointing out these dynamics, I do not mean to infer that these athletes' experiences are universally negative. One might not experience alienation beyond the reification of their labor and service to the nation. And one might see opportunity in the instrumental decisions that are forced by FIFA policy. Liminality can appear for some athletes as something to embrace. So I want to end with this note from Cameroon international Michaela Abam, who advocated in a recorded interview with Black Arrow FC for the opportunities that she's had. I'm American, I'm Cameroonian, I'm both, and I'm proud. Being able to represent and play at the highest stages, putting that flag upon our chest, wearing the jersey, singing the anthem is something that I hold the highest honor of doing. And I think the best part and the best decision of my career that I've made thus far. A lot of players are in my shoes of having dual nationality as well, you know. And being able to use my platform to show that we really need to embrace those parts of us that make us us is huge for me. Viewing the United States through its position as a global exporter of soccer talent offers a lens through which we can more clearly understand how nationality functions on a spectrum, even in spaces where, like with FIFA and the World Cup, organizing principles demand interpretations of nationality as unitary and fixed. While my work on American-born women began as one chapter in a broader dissertation, it's continued to grow to an extent where I see this growing into a whole book soon. So thank you for spending the past half hour, 35 minutes or so with me on this first Friday in April, as I laid out the early fundaments of this project. Stay tuned as it hopefully expands into something that can be advanced closer to publication in the next few years. But for now, I just want to say again, thank you. And I look forward to using the remainder of our time here to answer any and all of your questions, to take any of your comments that you want to offer, and just to chat further about what I've found to be a really fascinating subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. That was brilliant. Great to see all your hard work, into this presentation, getting a sense of some of your prose style, probably having read some sections from the dissertation itself. So really fascinating, and thank you for sharing with us. So I will open up the floor to Michael Saunders, who's calling from Florida, and he has the first question. Michael.
Well, first, Zach, I have one word for your presentation, and I look forward to its continuance. Brilliant. And thank you so much for taking the time to put that together. I realize that the amount of work that it took was ginormous. I find it interesting that we're beginning to, my first comment is I find it also interesting that the U.S. women's national team is finally beginning to look at some of those Americans that are playing overseas, where before they were not doing so. And that leads to my question. In your investigation, in your et cetera, did the NWSL mandate, whereby players on the national team had to play in the NWSL, which probably kept the NWSL alive, which was an economic decision in one way. Did you take that into consideration in this discussion? I would think it does, but I have the feeling you have more data on that than I can speak to.
It's a marvelous question, Michael. To be honest, in terms of the actual analysis I did here, I did look at how participation in, who a player was participating for on the club level at the time of the World Cup, impacted whether they might have been called up or not. I can't speak to how I didn't dig deeply enough into the NWSL's policies and everything, because in a lot of ways, like I said, it was one chapter and I was looking at one specific case study that was actually from mainly in 1999 with the Mexico case. So that predated the NWSL. But I think you're right in pointing to the fact that some of those policies do help the league itself, in terms of being able to stay afloat, to stay relevant, and in turn to give those players the exposure to then get called up, not just for the U.S. national team, but other teams as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that answers my question. I just, again, my only addition to it, that was a federation mandate that was imposed on the NWSL.
Yeah.
Just for everybody. You may know it, folks, but just want to make that clear.
And I do appreciate the clarification. So thank you.
All right.
Tom McCabe from London will jump in next. You answered a few of the questions I was writing down in the course of your presentation. One was, it's very much data driven. I was looking for maybe an anecdote as to the most fascinating instrumental decision made by a player that you came across. And then second question was, where are these soccer towns? I'm interested in soccer towns. Where are they clustering? What states, what parts of states? And you've answered that. Maybe you can comment further on that. But here's the question I'd love to ask. Was there a moment, an epiphany where you're like, okay, this is going to be my dissertation, right? I'm going to look at multinationality. The U.S. is producing all this talent. These U.S.-born players are choosing to represent other World Cup teams. I'd love maybe, how that coalesced or came together, for you.
Oh, that's a spectacular question, Tom. And it's always hard to point to one just, light bulb moment over your head. But if I had to pinpoint one, for the longest time, the dissertation was more specifically focused on foreign-born players at the World Cup. And I think it's a really small but critical distinction to expand that to thinking about multinationality. And that led to me basically redoing a data set that I had already compiled, completely throwing it out and starting from scratch and thinking more clearly about multinationality and the questions I answered. And I think the thing that really flipped the switch for me and was actually Sofia Huerta, who competed for Mexico and was on the Mexican national team, and then took advantage of the contingencies of FIFA policy, then allowing her to make the one-time switch back to the United States so that she could then become one of the first Mexican-American players to compete for the United States in 2023, rather than another one of the American-Mexican players competing for Mexico or trying to get Mexico to the World Cup again. And when I saw that distinction, it really flipped the switch for me. And then there were other players like Damaris Eguerola, who played for the Netherlands, born in the United States, Spanish mother, Dutch, or a Spanish father, Dutch mother. Her father was a professional highlight player. And then when his career ended, they moved back to where he was from in Spain. And so most of her formative experiences were in Spain. And for those who follow women's soccer, you know, the Spanish national team, despite winning the 2023 World Cup, has had some serious issues in terms of management at both the coaching and the executive levels. So Eguerola basically said, I'm not dealing with Spain anymore. She was one of the players that basically said, thanks, but no thanks. Don't try calling me up again. And both the United States and the Netherlands were looking to possibly get her in on that one-time switch. And the fact that she chose the Netherlands and that she had this history that had bounced her between 3 nationalities really made me realize that just thinking about foreign-born players didn't take it far enough. So I guess those would probably be the 2 players that kind of made me rethink how I thought about this, because it's been basically a decade-long project of thinking about foreign-born players. And some of my earliest research looked at, like you said, those hotbeds, which in the women's case are very much places like Southern California, the Bay Area, Houston, and Dallas are both hotbeds in terms of Texas. So those are the kinds of places that we see a lot of these both U.S. national team players and US born players on other national teams hailing from. Hopefully I covered all of the questions you would ask there.
I'm going to ask a quick follow-up on these hotbeds. Are these women coming out of the pay-to-play system, or more of, you know, an ethnic community, whether it's the Mexican American community? I mean, that's really complicated to probably try to unpack that.
At least in the Mexican case, the interesting thing is Carlo Pedrin he's the father of Tawny Pedrin, never actually made the Mexican team, but he was one of the first people to go to the Mexican Federation. He had connections in the Federation because he'd been a businessman in both Tijuana and San Diego. And so he went to Terán Silva, who had just taken over as vice president, and said, hey, this law just passed. What do you say about getting players like my daughter onto your team? You know, I think it'd be really great if she could represent Mexico. And he learned about that legal change reading an Airplane magazine as they were flying back from a tournament in DC to California. So a lot of them do come from that pay-to-play tradition. I think in a lot of ways that still does influence. You know, I talked about Title IX and the influence, and that gets people starting to play the game. But as we've seen so much with development, taking it to that next level really depends on if you're in a hotbed where you can get that year-round opportunity to play both for your school and your club.
Thank you. We'll turn it over to George Kiosis in California for the next comment question.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Zach. That was awesome. And I was particularly interested in the third question you asked about how US-born women experience playing for another country. And you kind of anticipated my question there at the end when you touched on the issue of alienation. And I would imagine that that's shaped in part by language, particularly having or not having the language skills to communicate with players, coaches, and staff in their native tongue. And so my question is, do you have a sense of how language impacts how US-born players are received? Or are we at the point where English is now so ubiquitous that that might be less of an issue than it otherwise might be?
I think it obviously depends on the case. I think with Mexico, one of the big issues and one of the big sort of workplace alienation issues on the team was that so many of the American-born women coming to play for Mexico couldn't speak Spanish. And so it becomes cliquish at times when you can only speak with certain people on the team who are in a very similar circumstance as you. And I think we saw, like, I hate, drawing from a men's case, but this is one that's fresh from my dissertation as well. It was a similar thing for, even if it wasn't language, the Surinamese players on the Dutch national team during the 1990s faced similar things where, just because they grew up in the Surinamese diaspora there in the urban communities in the Netherlands, they had certain experiences that drew them together, that weren't necessarily informed by language barriers, but those similar barriers play out in other ways. But in general, I think that where those language barriers are biggest have been some of those biggest sites of alienation where players are struggling, both to be accepted by their teammates and to be accepted by the broader public as somebody worthy of wearing the jersey.
I will ask a hot take question here. This is Tom again in London. The U.S. women's national team will not win another World Cup anytime soon. Based on your dissertation and your study of women's national teams worldwide, where do you stand on that?
Ooh, that is a hot take question, Tom. And I think that's perfect for people who are especially listening in podcast form. I would argue that other, some of the major global powers, the traditional powers in world soccer, at least on the men's side, are beginning to invest more on the women's side as well. We've seen that with Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, France, England, and so on. These places that have, gone far in men's tournaments and been regular features in the men's tournament are starting to take women's soccer more seriously. And I think they, in some ways, have the infrastructure to pass along better tactical training at younger ages, especially because so much of early development is either dependent on volunteer coaching, as so many of us here today might be familiar with, or coaching that you have to pay a great deal to get access to. And usually that access is only at a later point of development. So I think in some ways that early head start that the United States had in terms of Title IX building up a pool of talented players with a good baseline, could very well be pipped in the coming World Cup campaigns. Now, do I want to scream that the sky is falling necessarily, that the United States will never win another World Cup again? I think it's a little premature to say that based on, the fact that they were bounced out in the quarterfinals. It's not like they it was or was it the round of 16? I can't even remember now with the 2023 World Cup. But the fact that they didn't make the semifinals, they're still in the knockout stages. They're still advancing out of their group, whether it might be less comfortable or more comfortable. The same thing happens with teams, in men's tournaments as well. How many times have we heard about, like Italy struggling to get out of the group stage, for instance, in men's tournaments. So I don't think that it's going to be a foregone conclusion that the United States will make it to semifinals and finals like they have, for the first 28 years of Women's World Cup history. I don't think the next 28 years of Women's World Cup history looks the same way. But I think they're regularly there among the top 6 or so teams in the world bouncing around. But I think that as those other hotbeds around the world develop more, it's going to be that much harder to depend on just the sheer numbers of women playing the game here to make up the national team. But at the same time, we see other national teams are still, to a greater extent over the past few campaigns, depending more and more on US born talent as well. So it's kind of a hard thing to say that the United States is suddenly, fallen so far behind these other, European, powers that, have a more traditional history with the game, at least on the men's side.
Yeah, complicated question. Thanks for taking a run at it.
I might have danced around it a little bit, but I guess you're
a good academic, doctor, right?
Yeah. The too long didn't read, I guess, would be that I think it might be overblown to say that the U.S. never wins another World Cup again.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Fair. Back to you, Michael, in Florida.
Well, I'm really addressing your question, Tom, but I like the response by Zach. I think some of the things you have to take a look at is let's not talk about the 2023 World Cup other than, hey, that's the norm, guys. We're one of 3 national teams and the only women's national team that went to 3 World Cup finals in a row.
Yeah.
And you can talk about all the injuries and things of that nature that impacted our performance in 2023. But at the same time, guess what? That's a natural thing that happens in the sport, even on the men's side. Let's just take a look at Brazil. When was the last time they got to a final? All right. I believe it was 2002. So it is, it's quite a long time for them. So we should put that in perspective in terms of your question, Tom. Secondly, if you take a look at the development side, I'm encouraged both on the men and the women, but specifically for the women, that even bringing on Emma who has a lot of roots in her development in the United States, as many of us know. They have 6 players that are playing in Europe. Some of them, and that 2 of them right off the back are 2 that you're referring to, Zach, and that's in Johannes and Gimeni.
Mm-hmm.
And they could have played for either Holland or I forget what the other one could have played for. But the fact is they're now been picked by the national team, and that is Emma. And what she's doing is probably going with Crocker's statement, we've got to change to a more technical side. That's the only way I can say it. We're not going to become Spain overnight. Let's make that clear from a pure football standpoint. But the fact that the United States has to move to a different hybrid style is the direction. And so to your question, Tom, I think it is premature to say that the United States will not win another World Cup. Maybe not in my lifetime anymore, but it will happen.
Yeah, I mean, it was meant to be a provocative question. I'm here in London. I walk 15 minutes to the Emirates, and there are 60,000 fans at the Arsenal women's matches.
Yeah.
And I believe that they could fill it for the men one weekend, women next weekend, men, women. That's not the case. There's a limited number of games, but there's so much growth going on in the WSL, La Liga Femenil. I would say with that infrastructure that you mentioned, and Zach mentioned, that it's getting fed into that infrastructure, the coaching, the history in the game. I loved how you put that, Zach. Might not be history in the women's game, but cultural history, family, community history. I think we could, if we're not careful, be seeing a changing of the guard, when it comes to women's World Cups, which, if you're a fan of the game, that's fascinating, development, from my point of view.
Well, and I think just to wrap up on this subject, I think Michael makes a really good point that if we view 2023 as the new normal, where the United States is one of 8 teams, 8 to 10 teams that could ostensibly advance to the final in any given tournament, but isn't guaranteed of doing so anymore, it gives a more realistic perspective on how to move forward. I think Chuck Carlson had the next question, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Chuck, the official historian of Chicago House, calling from the Midwest. Chuck.
Oh, you sound like a chipmunk, Chuck. While you're figuring out audio, Chuck, I want to answer a question that Arrow Selkeld from North Carolina left in the chat. Arrow asked, they asked, I'm curious about what it will take for more non-US born players like Catarina Macario to play for the US women's national team, like the number of US born players on other national teams. But it always brings to mind Abby Wambach's comments about Klinsmann's use of foreign guys during his men's national team tenure. And it's really fascinating. I think, like I mentioned, Sofia Huerta, switching from Mexico back to the US. I think we might see more cases like that rather than cases of the US explicitly looking outside. Now, that's not to say that Macario never gets a call up, right? But I think if we do see the US calling on those types of players, it's going to be a situation like we saw with Brazil calling up Angelina, where she moved to Brazil. She moved to Sao Paulo with her Brazilian family when she was, I think, 3 or 4 years old, and grew up in, the Brazilian youth system and played for Brazilian clubs, started her career with Brazilian clubs before moving out of the country. So I think it's going to be the US calling on those type of players that move here as infants or as young children and grow up within the US system that will probably be most likely to get those types of call-ups.
Excellent. If Chuck has figured out his audio, he can join us. No, you still sound like
It might be best to
Alvin,
put that question in the chat, Chuck, and I would be happy to answer that for you.
Here's another kind of contemporary question. I don't get to watch the NWSL over here. But I do watch the Champions League and, the WSL, some La Liga. The standard is really high. And it's getting better, and there are Americans playing in those leagues. How would you compare the NWSL and some of these European leagues?
I think you're right that, I mean, we're seeing a high tactical level in a really small window of time. We're seeing tactical growth just exponential, and we're seeing the popularity of the game grow in similar fashion. And I think more than anything, it speaks to the fact that when you put investment into the women's game, women can really do great things. They can become phenomenal athletes when they have the support to do so. And so you know, I think the fact that that support is coming there, and the fact that more US women are looking to go into those leagues and maybe test the waters of playing there, definitely open the door to, you know, the NWSL not necessarily being the one dominant league like we saw with previous women's leagues in the US, where it was basically the only game in town if you wanted to go pro. So yeah, I think tactically we're seeing, you know, things grow overseas really rapidly. But that's not to diminish what the NWSL offers either. I think it's really important to recognize that women's soccer in the United States is not just a matter of, you know, punt and run. There is certainly a lot of nuance in the women's game here, and I think tactically it's getting better in the United States as well, as you're seeing other countries push and develop their own systems. It's forcing US soccer and everyone else to recognize that that becomes that much more important earlier, and thus rises the boat all the way up to the pro level as well.
So,
Well, before Michael, you know, gets, let's say, the final question, Zach, could you check the chat? Chuck has kind of a two-part question. One, are you seeing recruitment of non-US players by other countries? And are you looking to expand your research beyond the World Cup? For example, in the Dominican Republic, in you know, CONCACAF Women's Cup or the other competitions.
Could you repeat the first question for me, please?
Are you seeing recruitment of non-US players by other countries? You know, an uptick in that.
Yes. Certainly. You know, I don't think it's just the United States at this point that is funneling players around. Like, you know, I mentioned the Moroccan men's national team. But the fact is, Morocco's women's national team also qualified for the 2023 World Cup. And just like the men's team, I don't think the ratio was quite as high, but I think it was 10 of the 23 players on their roster were from non-Moroccan. They were born outside of Morocco. None of those players were from the United States. So the fact is you're seeing countries increasingly look to where their diasporas are at. So for Morocco, it's looking toward France, it's looking toward the Netherlands, it's looking toward some of those places where parents and grandparents have migrated to European work opportunities, for instance. So you're certainly seeing the recruitment on that level. And it's a global phenomenon in the women's game, just like it is in the men's game. Now, the second question, I'm blanking again, Tom. Sorry.
Say for other competitions,
Oh,
other leagues, for example, like the Dominican Republic. Yeah.
Expanding the research. Certainly, because I think part of the risk of doing the World Cup and just the World Cup is the fact that, you know, only 32 nations, or, you know, soon for the men's tournament, 48 will make it in. But the fact is only a finite number get to qualify in any tournament. And so it gives us a snapshot of certain nations in time. But you're absolutely right. I think drilling down to, you know, the Gold Cup, the Copa America, those types of continental tournaments is the next step for this. I'd also like to look more into the Olympic football tournament, especially on the women's side, because that has, you know, for a long time been sort of the 1B tournament in terms of preeminence. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room to expand this further. As Tom mentioned at the very beginning, I'm also interested in these kind of vagaries of nationality beyond soccer itself. So, you know, I've looked at them in competitive eating. I've looked at them in Winter Olympic sports, you know, kind of tried to expand beyond just soccer as well. But I think what makes soccer really unique is the way that FIFA's policies are structured as even more restrictive than IOC policies around nationality and eligibility and what we see in other sports, for instance. FIFA has a particularly strict interpretation of unitary nationality that I think makes soccer such an interesting site for it. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the Gold Cup and other tournaments like that are kind of the next frontier for taking this further.
And we will go back to Michael Saunders for the final comment question.
Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question, but as far as your question about the NWSL versus all the other leagues, I just put it very simply. It's all about investment. And if you take a look at the European teams, there are 5 federations that everyone looks at, and it's the same 5 federations for the women and the men. Okay. So it's, again, investment, what you're willing to spend in terms of facilities, in terms of salaries. And what we're seeing with the NWSL is this is opened up. And so watch this space. I predict that the NWSL wants to become the NHL of women's football. Just watch this space. Anyway, my final comment comes back to your thesis, Zach.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I mean, I'm drawing a conclusion which probably has a lot of illogic in it. But isn't it a disadvantage to be a country of 300 to 400,000 players for players to have an opportunity to play in a World Cup when they have other opportunities where they recognize where they stand and they say, well, I'm on the bubble, but if I go to Mexico or I go to Holland because of my background, I'll get in the World Cup. And I think that's something that is a challenge to our federation to make sure that they expose players with potential to have an equal chance. And that's just my final comment.
And I think it's a really great place to end it, Michael, where the reality is like I said, if a country wants to actively recruit, they're going to go look in that pool. And they might not get their first, second, or third choice, but they're going to find some American that is technically proficient and can play for their team. If they're that motivated to do so, and it might be somebody that would have never been on the U.S. national team's radar. And in some cases, it might very well be. But like you said, if the U.S. national team is looking into those sort of hidden corners and finding these talented players, like, for instance, Sofia Huerta, who had to go to Mexico and then come back to really be recognized as somebody, and to be really kind of transform her game to a new position as well, to really be embraced on the U.S. national team. The fact is the more you look in those kind of hidden corners, you're going to find some of those players, but because except for like a Karen Bardsley, for instance, most of these players wanted to play for the U.S. national team. They grew up in American in the American education system and playing on American club teams, dreaming about putting on the U.S. national team uniform. And if you can get to them earlier and you can make the team a more diverse space where not only are you looking to some of these players, but you're making it a more comfortable space for all of these players where, somebody growing up, in the Mexican diaspora can see themselves within the players on the U.S. national team and not just the players on the Mexican national team.
Yeah.
It makes all parties stronger. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Zach Bigalke. Thank you to those who attended. You can watch this as a video, which I might recommend because there's some really beautiful slides that accompany the talk, or listen on the podcast. And I see one last hand. George, over to you. Okay, that was a random hand. But thank you very much to Zach and to all who will listen and watch this and who joined us today. Stay tuned for other announcements about future talks. Thanks again. Zach, that was great. Thank you.
And you've got to turn the recording off, Tom, because you're host now.
Yep, stop recording.